And I am thankful again for the opportunity to be here. We're going to be spending most of our time this morning over in Daniel chapter 3, if you want to turn over there. Daniel chapter 3 has quickly become one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, and it's one that, at least the story, we're all familiar with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But there are so many really good lessons that we can learn from this story, and how the three of them conducted themselves and how God interacted with them and delivered them. So this morning I hope that we can go through this chapter and glean some of those good lessons. So to set up the context here, remember in the book of Daniel, the Jews are in Babylonian captivity. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken as youths from Jerusalem, and not long after they got to Babylon, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were promoted and put over the affairs of the kingdom of Babylon. And so getting into Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 1, we read, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plains of Dura in the province of Babylon. So in chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, we read about Nebuchadnezzar setting up this idol in the plains of Dura. And we read in verse 4 that there was this command for the people. It says, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar set up." Now this image of gold probably isn't King Nebuchadnezzar himself. There are a lot of kings in the ancient times who thought themselves as gods. I think of the pharaohs who thought themselves as gods. But the Babylonian kings generally didn't think that. Odds are this was probably the god Marduk, which the Babylonians saw as the king of the gods. So this was probably an image of Marduk. And honestly, if Nebuchadnezzar was there, and it was him, why not just worship the man? I don't think it's correct to say that this image was of Nebuchadnezzar himself. We learn that it's got these really odd dimensions. In the Bible we read it's 60 by 6 cubits. That would translate to about 90 foot tall and 9 foot wide, which very odd proportions. So it probably also isn't correct to think of it as just one very tall, thin image of Marduk. It's probably a statue sitting on a stand that is 90 foot by 9 foot. And it's set up on the plains of Dura in Babylon. And all of the government officials were invited to come and worship this thing. All of the peoples. And the government officials were included in that, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now the question comes, where does Daniel come into this? Why isn't he here? That's always been one of my questions. At the end of chapter 2, we read in verse 48, it said, Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. So, in this, before Nebuchadnezzar goes and sets up this image, and he's obviously there, along with all of the people who are there, someone has to be back running the kingdom. And I would say that's where Daniel is, and that's why Daniel doesn't stand up against this, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego does. So, being an order of the king, let's put ourselves in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's shoes. Being government officials, coming to this thing and being commanded by the king to bow down to this. This was a very, very high-pressure situation. In verses 1 through 7, the authority of the king is pounded in again and again. The word king is mentioned 6 times in these 7 verses. Obviously, there's the factor of the conformity to the crowd. All of these people are standing around, and when everyone bows down, who's going to be the 3 people just standing up in front of everybody? So that's obviously one thing that would add to the pressure of the situation. And there's also, we learn, an intimidation of the penalty that they're given. In verse 6, we read that whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a fiery furnace. So it wasn't just that the king told them to do this. It wasn't just that there would be this social pressure because of all the people around them bowing down to this image. But there was the threat of death if they did not do it. So this was a very high pressure situation for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So what is the result of this? Well, obviously the king's command is carried out. And everyone bows down to this image, except 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'd like to go off a little bit real quickly here and talk about what they are doing. They are bowing down to this golden image that was created by the king, as we read later, and that specifically is said that Nebuchadnezzar set up. And if you read this, you see that phrase fairly often in the entire chapter. In verse 3, at the end of verse 3, the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And I think this was intentional on the part of the writer to point out that this was something that King Nebuchadnezzar created. He made it. It wasn't something that was worthy of worship. It was an idol. A creation of man. And we talk a lot about idolatry and how that translates to us today. But honestly, I don't think any of us can really put it better than Isaiah did in Isaiah chapter 44, starting verse 9. And I'd just like to read that because it's just too good not to read. Isaiah chapter 44, starting in verse 9 and going through verse 20. Isaiah speaks here about the true idiocy of idolatry. Starting in verse 9. Isaiah chapter 44. All who fashion idols are nothing, and the things they delight in do not profit. Their witnesses neither see nor know that they may be put to shame. Who fashions a god or casts an idol that is profitable for nothing? Behold, all his companions shall be put to shame, and the craftsmen are only human. Let them all assemble, let them all stand forth. They shall be terrified, they shall be put to shame together. The ironsmith takes a cutting tool and works it over the coals. He fashions it with hammers and works it with his strong arm. He becomes hungry and his strength falls. He drinks no water and is faint. The carpenter stretches a line. He marks it out with a pencil. He shapes it with planes and marks it with a compass. He shapes it into the figure of a man, with the beauty of a man to dwell in a house. He cuts down cedars, or he chooses a cypress tree or an oak and lets it grow strong among the trees of the forest. He plants a cedar and the rain nourishes it. Then it becomes fuel for a man. He takes a part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. Also, he makes a god and worships it. He makes it an idol and falls down before it. Half of it he burns in the fire. Over the half he eats meat. He roasts it and is satisfied. He warms himself and says, "Aha, I am warm. I have seen the fire." And the rest of it he makes into an idol, a god, and falls down to it and worships it. He prays to it and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." They know not, nor do they discern, for he has shut their eyes, so they cannot see, and their hearts they cannot understand. No one considers, nor is there knowledge or discernment to say, half of it I burned in the fire. I also baked bread on its coals. I roasted meat and have eaten. What shall I make the rest of it of an abomination? Shall I fall down before a block of wood? He feeds on ashes. A deluded heart has led him astray, and he cannot deliver himself, or say, is there a lie in my right hand? So Isaiah here paints a really vivid picture of just how ridiculous making idols and worshiping idols is. Talking about a man who cuts down a tree and takes half of it and makes a fire and cooks his dinner, and then the other half he fashions into the shape of a man just like him, and then he falls down and worships it, saying, deliver me, for you are my God. It's just utterly ridiculous, and that's exactly what is happening here. I think the clincher statement in that passage I just read was in verse 19. That in effect they are falling down before a block of wood. And that's all they are. There's no power in that block of wood. There's no power in this golden image that has been set up by King Nebuchadnezzar. These idols, these gods cannot stand before the one who made the ones who made the idols. They're nothing but a second-hand creation of God Himself. I'm also reminded of 1 Samuel chapter 5 when the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant and put it in their temple. And when they would come back the next day, they would find their god Dagon bowing down before the Ark of the Covenant. And then the next day they came, but he was bowing down and his hands were cut off as well. It just shows that there is absolutely nothing that man can create that can stand in the place of God Himself. And we may look and we may laugh at this. And we may see that it is just ridiculous how they could fall down before a block of wood. But how often do we do the very same thing? Modern idols can be just as bad, and we can be just as foolish as that man in Isaiah chapter 44. Money, pleasure, work, anything that causes our eyes to slip from God down to whatever we're going towards at that moment is an idol. And it can be so easy to fall into this because it's, especially in the country that we live in, the society in which we live, it is pounded into our head constantly. You drive down the road, you see billboards, you're watching television, you see commercials, and even the television itself, often there are things in that causes our eyes to fall from our God. And these things that we become infatuated with, which we, whether we explicitly say it or not, we are beginning to put our faith in and our hope in, they're just temporary. They're just transitory. There's nothing that we can take with us when we die, when we go to be with the God in heaven, who is the only eternal thing that we can set our eyes on. So just like these idols that the people of old set up and they fell down before worship, and that were just as fragile and would not last, so are the things that we can fix our eyes on and bow down before, fall down before our modern idols. They will not last. We cannot keep them. The only one who will stand the test of eternity is God Himself. So we should fix our eyes on Him and not let our eyes slip onto these worldly idols, as even the Israelites did many times when during their history in the Old Testament. We need to fix our gaze on the one who will not fail, who will never disappoint, and the only one who can truly fulfill us. Because a block of wood certainly cannot do that. So in chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, we read of the situation that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in. There's this idol, and they are being commanded to fall down before it and worship it as if it is their God. However, they have a different idea of what they're going to do. So in chapter 3, starting in verse 8, verses 8 through 12, we find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being accused. Starting in verse 8, it reads, "Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of all of these instruments shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon.' Who do you think they are? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are accused of not falling down before this idol that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And it's a completely just accusation. They are guilty of what they are accused to do. However, it was also the right thing to do. And this comes into our second application. Standing alone. As I mentioned before, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in a very high pressure situation. Everything was going against them, but they still had a choice on what they can do. They could either fall down and worship the idol and keep their titles, keep their lives, keep their livelihood, keep their material possessions. Or they could stand up and honor God and lose their titles, lose their lives, lose their livelihood, lose their material possessions. And what did they do? They stood and honored God. And I want you to imagine this with me for a moment. How I always imagine the scene was this idol standing up in the center of this field, the plain of Dura, and there are instruments all around it. And then all around the instruments is just this sea of people standing in this plain. And suddenly, the music starts. All of these instruments start playing, and that's the cue for everyone to start bowing down. And everybody then starts bowing down. Imagine you're Shadrach. And you don't bow down. You stand up. And you're still standing, and everybody around you is prostrate on the ground before this golden idol. And you're looking around, and you think you're the only one, but then standing over there, you see Meshach. And then you look a little harder, and then standing over there, you see Abednego. And you realize that even though you are standing alone in your immediate vicinity, you are not alone. They were not alone. They had one another. And what more, they had the God who created them, the one who was far more powerful and who would deliver them, that idol standing there could not do and would not do. So they were standing alone in the midst of a sea of individuals bowing down to this idol. And this is a powerful lesson for us today. In the midst of a generation that seems to be increasingly hostile towards God and His statutes, we must stand firm in the truth, against false teaching, against the things that the world says are okay, but God has other ideas about. We must stand firm against a culture that is in all sides trying to get us to cave in. A hypersexualized culture full of music and media that is popular and sinful, that is all around us. As I stated before, we must stand as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood, alone, against the world. So we too have to stand against the world, who so often is trying to get us to bow down to the idol. And sometimes we must stand alone. sometimes we may not have people with us there right then, as Shadrach had Meshach, and Meshach had Abednego, and Abednego had Shadrach. But still, we need to look at Jesus. What did Jesus do in the midst of persecution, in the midst of what the world wanted Him to do? He did the will of the Father. He didn't let, even after all of His disciples left Him, to go and walk that lonely road towards the cross. What could He do? He could have called 10,000 angels to come and save Him. But did He? No. He didn't. He stood alone and did the thing that God wanted Him to do, knowing that for the joy set before Him, He endured the cross. And I would say that much of the same idea was in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's mind, that for the joy set before them, their eyes fixed on the Father, they endured this persecution. They stood alone. And sometimes we must stand alone. But more often than not, I would say, just like Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego had one another, so we too, as Christians, as the body of Christ, have each other to lean on and to encourage one another and to help stand. And we have a great resource here in this room and all of the other Christians who are out there beyond those doors. Because we all have this singular goal. The singular goal is to do the will of the Father, to get to the goal of heaven. And knowing that we all have the same goal, and we have to understand that if we neglect to lift each other up, if we neglect to lean on one another, we are missing a great resource in order to help us towards that goal of honoring our Father, of being like God, and being with Him in heaven forever. But even if we don't have one another at that moment, remember we always have Jesus to be with us. In Matthew chapter 28, as He is giving His final command to His disciples to go out into all the world and to preach the gospel, what does He say to them? He says, "Lo, I will be with you even to the end of the age." That age has not ended yet. We, too, can take hold of that promise that Jesus Christ is with us in the midst of all of our trials, of all of the world getting us to bow down. Jesus is with us. So even when we may feel alone, far more alone than we've ever been before, know that Jesus Christ is standing there with you. So to stand alone against the idolatry of this world can be a very difficult thing to do. But just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were standing alone in that sea of people bowing down to this idol, so we too must stand alone at times in a sea of people who do not honor God as He deserves. So moving on in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 13 through 15, we find Nebuchadnezzar's reaction to this news of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he's angry, and rightly so. Honestly, what they were doing was incomprehensible to King Nebuchadnezzar, because you have to remember that the Babylonians, they did not believe in a singular God. They believed in many gods. They were polytheistic. So the idea that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego wouldn't bow down to Marduk, it was just, he didn't understand it, because what is bowing down to another god? Knowing that there are thousands of gods out there. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego believed in something unique in the ancient world, that there was one God who created heavens and earth. One all-powerful God, and that image right there didn't represent a god at all. It was just a block of gold standing up there. So they don't comply. Nebuchadnezzar is angry, but they do not comply. And we get their response to his anger in verses 16 through 18, which brings us into our third application. Their response in verse 16, I think, is very interesting and quite powerful. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Can you imagine the president coming up to you and telling you to do something, or asking you to do something, and you decide to not do it because it conflicts with your beliefs, and just standing up before him and telling him, I have no need to answer you in this matter? I think that'd be pretty nerve-wracking for most of us. But it shows such a depth of conviction in their belief in God, and that their mind was already made up in what they were going to do. That no matter what was put in their path, they weren't going to bow down. They had already decided, I am not going to bow down to this false god. And even though the king himself was angry at me and wanted me to do this, I wasn't going to do that. That was their attitude. So we can learn a lot from that in making up our minds about what we're going to do before we get to those situations. Am I going to follow God? Or am I going to follow my desires? Or what the world wants me to do? Make up your mind to follow God before we get into those situations. But verses 17 and 18, I think, are the real turning point of this story. And what we can really gain, probably the greatest lesson, I think, from the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Verses 17 and 18, they continue in their response to the king, saying, If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. And here's the clincher. Verse 18. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And I think that's an incredible statement, because even though Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had full faith that God could save them from the burning fiery furnace, they also knew that they very well may not be saved. They very well may not be delivered from this bodily death in the fiery furnace. And yet, they valued their obedience to God over the deliverance of their bodies. They knew that God was able to save them, but if He does, that's great. But if not, they still wouldn't bow down to that image. And I think that just shows an unshakable faith in God that they had. What they were going to do, their obedience to God, it wasn't dependent on what God could do for them. And this really is the true test of persecution, in whatever form it is. Whether it's our being put down for believing in Jesus Christ, or whether it is like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, facing the death of our bodies. This is the true test of persecution. What do you do when you are faced with this, knowing that you most likely will not be delivered from this trial? Do you still stand with God? That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They knew that there was a high probability that they were going to die. And yet they still did not give themselves over to the king. They didn't bow down to the idol and betray the God who had given them so much already. And it wasn't about what God can do for them. How often do we preface our prayers, maybe not explicitly, but in the way that we say them, or our attitude in them, it asks God, I will do this if you do that. We have this idea almost of God as a vending machine. And, I would say that that's even more that's just about as idolatrous as what the Babylonians were doing here. Because when you think about idolatry in the ancient world, why did they worship those idols? They worshipped the rain god. They bowed down to the rain god so that they can get rain for their harvest. They would pray to the god of the harvest so that they would get good harvest that year. They treated their gods as vending machines. It was a symbiotic relationship. They understood that if I give sacrifices to you, then you're going to do something for me in exchange. And sometimes we can act like that in our prayers. It's not about just perfect obedience to God because of what He has done for us and promised us. But it's an idea, if you do this for me, God, I will do this for you. And we cannot have that attitude if we are going to be true followers of Jesus Christ. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not have that attitude. And they were faced with something far more destructive than what any of us have experienced in our lives. Death of their bodies. We need to have a faith like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that says, God, I will be obedient to you even in the face of death. And even in the smaller things as well. We need to stand for Him in the daily. Drinking or God. Those bad influences or God. Whatever idol we are looking towards at the moment or God. Every single day, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were given, we are given a choice. Do I fall down and worship at the idol of pleasure? Or do I stand and give honor to God in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation? And those three men stood and continued to stand with the full knowledge that God could save them, yet probably wouldn't. Right up until they were thrown into the furnace. And then we get to the conclusion of the story. Daniel chapter 3, verses 19 through 30. And we can remember what happened in the rest of the story. The king is filled with fury at their response, has the furnace heated 7 times hotter, so hot that when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are bound, the guards throwing them in the furnace died because it was so hot. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell bound into the furnace. And yet, what the king saw next was absolutely astonishing. And if any of us were there, I think we would have the same reaction. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were up walking around in the flames, unharmed. And there was a 4th man in there. One that the king says is like a son of the gods, which is later identified as an angel. And this account here of this 4th man, this angel, coming into the furnace with them, their fears of God not delivering them were denied. God did deliver them. However, what He did not deliver them from was the trial. They were still thrown into the furnace. They still experienced the anger and fury of the king. God did not keep them out of the fire. God joined them in the fire. And the very same is true of us today. The Lord may not deliver us from the fires that we experience in our lives, the trials and temptations that we face, but you can rest assured that He is right there with us in the midst of them. God joins us in the fire, just as He joined Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And this should be an incredible comfort for us, knowing that in the midst of something that we are at our absolute lowest point, and we feel that we cry out to God and ask Him to deliver us from whatever trial we're facing at that moment, and yet, in the midst of our crying out, we don't see God standing right next to us in it. Because He is there. And we must have faith in Him that the trial in which we are experiencing is for our good. And that we may learn something from that, knowing that all things work out for those who truly love the Father and who devote themselves to Him, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. That even though we may experience fire and trials in this life, ultimately, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were delivered from the fire, so we too will be delivered in that final day when Jesus Christ comes on the clouds, and we will be drawn up together with Him to live in eternity. So what does King Nebuchadnezzar do after this? He honors God. We read that he puts another decree out that is directly contradictory to his former one of saying that everyone needs to bow down to this idol, but rather he says, whoever speaks against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. King Nebuchadnezzar saw these three men persevere through this fire and were delivered from this fire, and he was influenced for the better because of it. Just so, when others see us going against the grain, standing alone, getting through these trials and the fires of our lives, so they too will ask, why? How did you do that? And as lights in a dark world, they will see our God, and they will glorify Him because of the light that we are shining. So I hope this has been helpful this morning, looking at this story that many of us grew up with. In conclusion, remember that idolatry is foolishness, whether it be ancient or modern. We must be willing to stand for God in a world that is constantly against God. Our focus must be obedience, whether or not God will deliver our bodies in this life. And even though God may not deliver us from the fires, rest assured that He will join us in those fires that we experience. So this morning, if you have not tasted of the goodness of God, if you need to give your life to Him initially and be baptized for the remission of your sins, we can do that this morning. Or if you have fallen away, if you feel like you have not been devoted to our God as we should be, then we can help you this morning. Please come forward as we stand and sing this invitation song.